The battlefield was hell. That was true on every planet, in every war, in every corner of the galaxy. Plasma bolts streaked across the sky, explosions rattled the shattered remains of what had once been a bustling trade city, and the stench of charred metal and blood clung to the air like an inescapable curse. Lieutenant Othrek of the Vrax Dominion had seen countless conflicts. He had commanded troops against some of the most formidable species in the galaxy. He had fought against the Kranash hordes, the insectoid Clyrex, and even the cold-blooded reptilian Tyrak. Each species had their own warriors, their own tactics, their own brutal efficiency in the art of war. But never, never had he encountered anything as horrifying as the humans. It wasn't their soldiers that terrified him. Oh, the humans were formidable, of course. They fought with a reckless abandon that bordered on suicidal, using their bizarre ability to adapt in real time to shift strategies mid-battle. They were strong for their size, fast, and somehow, infuriatingly, always seemed to be laughing, even when they were losing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was their medics. Across the bombed-out battlefield, Othrek could see one now, moving like a spectre through the chaos, draped in the red cross that marked him as one of the human non-combatants. The universe had long established that medical personnel were sacred, not to be targeted in war. It was an unspoken rule. The humans never seemed to have gotten that memo. This so-called non-combatant was sprinting through open fire, weaving between explosions with an eerie precision. Plasma bolts zipped past him, shrapnel flew in every direction, and yet he kept going. His boots pounded against the ground as he closed the distance to a fallen soldier, his voice a roar over the gunfire. "Stay with me, Sergeant. You hear me? You're not dying today." Othrek had fought alongside medics from other species before. They were calm, clinical. They followed procedure, obeyed triage protocols. If a soldier was too far gone, they were marked as lost. Not this one. The human dropped to his knees beside his fallen comrade, a fellow human, barely clinging to life, his leg a mangled ruin from an explosion. Any other species would have administered pain relief and moved on. But the human medic. He pulled out a knife. Othrek recoiled in horror as the medic cut away the ruined armor and flesh with a speed that spoke of experience. His hands worked with brutal efficiency, tying off arteries, stopping the worst of the bleeding with foam that expanded and hardened on contact. The wounded soldier screamed through gritted teeth. "Shut up and breathe, McKinney. You're going to make it, you hear me? I said breathe." The sheer force of the medic's voice commanded the soldier's body to keep functioning. A Kranash warrior emerged from cover, aiming his plasma rifle at the exposed medic. Before Othrek could even shout a warning, the medic, the non-combatant, drew his sidearm and shot the alien twice in the chest without even looking up. Then he went right back to his work. Othrek's blood ran cold. That wasn't medicine. That was war. More humans joined the scene, forming a protective circle around the medic as he worked. These weren't soldiers guarding a helpless doctor. No, this was a combat unit obeying the orders of their field surgeon, like he was a warlord himself. The medic jammed a syringe into McKinney's chest. "Heart still beating. Good. You still owe me $50, and you're damn well gonna live long enough to pay me back." Another explosion sent dirt flying, and the medic barely flinched. He was already moving again, pressing something into McKinney's side. A hiss of pain, then a mechanical sound. Othrek realized, with dawning horror, that the human had just attached a prosthetic limb to his soldier in the middle of a goddamn battlefield. McKinney gasped, blinking up at his medic. You're walking off this field, McKinney. Move!" McKinney, who had, minutes ago, been on the verge of death, shoved himself to his feet. He was standing with a new metal leg that had just been attached mid-firefight. This wasn't possible. This wasn't war. This was necromancy. And the galaxy had no idea how to fight an enemy that refused to let their soldiers die. Othrek felt his hands trembling. He had survived decades of war. He had fought nightmares and monsters across the stars. But he had never felt fear like this. Because the humans didn't just fight to win. They fought to defy death itself. Lieutenant Othrek wasn't the only one watching. From a vantage point high above the battlefield, Commander Valrek of the Zulthan Empire observed the unfolding chaos with cold, calculating eyes. His species prided itself on strategic brilliance, on calculated warfare, on the belief that battle was won not by brute force, but by the art of attrition and maneuvering. Then the humans arrived, and suddenly the very foundation of warfare itself seemed to collapse under the weight of their sheer madness. Valrek had seen combat medics before. They were a necessary part of every military, but their purpose was logistical, not suicidal. In any other army, a medic's role was to stabilize the wounded so they could be transported off the battlefield. If a soldier was too far gone, the triage protocols were simple: leave them and conserve resources. But the humans, they weren't playing by the same rules. Valrek watched in stunned silence as 3 human medics sprinted into the battlefield, weaving through enemy fire like specters of war. Their bodies were unarmored, wearing only the marked insignia of the Red Cross. They should have been easy kills. But the Zulthan commander quickly realized why that wasn't the case. The enemy wasn't shooting at them. The Vraks, the Kranash, even Valrek's own Zulthan soldiers, none of them were targeting the human medics. Because to aim at one was to invoke something worse than death. He had seen it happen before. A week ago, in a smaller skirmish, one of his snipers had taken a shot at a human medic. A clean, perfect shot, plasma bolt through the center of the chest. The medic had collapsed instantly. The response had been unnatural. The human soldiers fighting in that engagement had stopped firing, not in fear, not in retreat, but in a moment of sheer, suffocating silence. And then, they charged. There was no discipline in that moment, no strategy, no tactics. The humans had roared as one, an inhuman, blood-curdling sound that sent even the hardened Zulthan warriors into a panic. They had broken through lines like a force of nature, butchering their way toward their fallen medic. Not one human was left standing by the end of that battle. But neither was a single Zulthan. It had taken 6 full units of reinforcements just to secure the region again. And now, here they were, doing it all over again. The medics rushed to the fallen. They did not hesitate. One of them slid to the ground, pressing gloved hands against a soldier's abdomen, where a plasma bolt had burned straight through the flesh. "I need a bioseal now," the human bellowed. Another medic, one with short dark hair and blood smeared across his arms, tossed him a pressurized vial. "Already on it." Valrek watched as the first medic plunged the vial into the wound. Almost instantly, a synthetic gel expanded outward, sealing the damage. The human's hands were already moving again, applying a pressure bandage and injecting another cocktail of fluids. All of this was happening under active fire. What species did this? What kind of creatures ran toward death with their hands full instead of their weapons drawn? Valrek's disbelief turned into outright horror as one of his own Zulthan soldiers made a fatal mistake. He fired at a medic. There was no time to warn him. The plasma bolt struck the human in the back, sending him sprawling forward with a guttural scream. The battlefield shifted. The air itself changed. The human soldiers, who had been disciplined, controlled, executing precise maneuvers, froze. Then, they turned. Their movements were slow, methodical, their helmets tracking the trajectory of the shot. The Zulthan soldier who had fired began stepping back, panic setting into his bioluminescent features. He was a veteran, a killer. He had fought in dozens of wars, but never against humans. He understood now what he had done. The humans charged, not recklessly, not in a blind rage, but with purpose. They didn't just shoot him. That would have been too merciful. They dismantled him. A hail of gunfire ripped through his body. Then, as his body hit the ground, a human soldier stepped forward and emptied another round into his corpse. "That was for Doc," the soldier muttered. Valrek swallowed hard. The medic, Doc, was still alive, but barely. He was on the ground, gasping, blood pooling beneath him. One of the other medics, This one with sharp green eyes and a scar running down his jaw was already working on him. "You're not dying, Doc," the green-eyed medic growled, pressing something against his wound. "You hear me? You do not get to die. That's an order." Doc gritted his teeth. Did you shoot that bastard?" "Oh, yeah." The green-eyed medic smirked. "We all did." "Good," Doc rasped. "Because if you didn't, I was gonna— Fuck!" Valrek watched in growing disbelief as Doc was already sitting up. Blood still poured from his wound, but it didn't seem to matter. "That's impossible," Valrek whispered. "He should be dead." The green-eyed medic must have heard him because he turned his head slightly, locking eyes with the Zulthan commander from across the battlefield. His voice carried over the gunfire. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said. Valrek didn't respond. The medic stood, wiped the blood off his hands, and picked up his rifle. "We don't die when we're supposed to," he said. "We die when we say it's time." Valrek took a slow, trembling step back, and for the first time in his life he realized humanity didn't just defy death, they rejected its very existence. The stories spread. At first they were rumors, whispers in the dark, shared between mercenaries and warlords in dimly lit stations, murmured over cheap drinks in the back alleys of neutral zones. Then came the reports, official military debriefings, security footage, distress calls intercepted from battlefields across the galaxy. And finally, the warnings. Do not engage human medics. Do not harm human medics. Do not interfere with human medics. Because if you did, you would not just be fighting their soldiers. You would be fighting their entire species. Across the Galactic Senate chamber, Councillor Zarek of the Vatari Confederation leaned back in his seat, his mandibles clicking in irritation. He had long dismissed the galaxy's paranoia over humans as simple fear-mongering. Yes, they were adaptable. Yes, they were unpredictable. But in the end, weren't they just another species of bipedal warmongers? That was before he had seen the footage. Zarek flexed his clawed fingers as the images replayed in his mind, a human medic tearing through gunfire to drag a wounded soldier to safety, then performing what could only be described as battlefield surgery while casually shooting an enemy soldier in the face with his sidearm. Then there was the other footage, the one he could not forget, the one that haunted him. It was from the war between the Ralzek Dominion and the United Terran forces. A skirmish, nothing major, but the Ralzek had believed themselves victorious after slaughtering most of the human forces in the region. They had even gone so far as to execute the captured human medics in a display of cruelty, broadcasting it across the system to demoralize the remaining human troops. The reaction had been immediate. Within hours, the human fleet had broken through the Ralzek defensive lines. They did not simply bombard the enemy forces from orbit. They did not merely push forward with calculated tactics. They hunted. Zarek had seen many battles in his time. He had seen species fight with fury, with vengeance, with righteous anger. But he had never seen anything like this. The humans did not kill with efficiency. They did not fight with discipline. They slaughtered. They found every Ralzek soldier responsible for the medic executions. They did not execute them on sight. That would have been merciful. Instead, they disabled them. Crippling injuries, non-lethal wounds. They left them alive, broken, bleeding, watching. Then they sent in the medics. Human medics, walking through the carnage, healing their own soldiers first, then turning to the wounded enemy. No one was spared their mercy. The Ralzek soldiers had been forced to live, to endure their own suffering, not with the release of death, but with the knowledge that the very beings they had butchered had saved them instead. And then, once the humans had finished their work, once the wounded had been stabilized, the pain minimized, and the procedures complete, they left them, alone, left to rot, to stare at the sky, to know that their survival had come not from their own people, but from the ones they had tortured. It was psychological warfare at its most refined, and it was terrifying. Zarek exhaled, glancing at the assembled members of the Senate. The chamber was silent. Everyone had seen the same reports. Everyone knew the truth now. The humans did not fear death. They did not allow their own to die, and if you forced their hand, they would make you live with that mistake. A counselor from the Zikar Dominion finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Are we certain this is the extent of their medical capabilities?" Another voice, this one from the Kyril Union, whispered, "We thought human soldiers were the greatest threat." That was our mistake. Zarek turned his gaze toward the human representative sitting across from him, Ambassador Lorraine Cho. She was silent, watching, studying. Finally, she spoke. "We don't leave our own behind." No bravado, no threats, just a simple truth. The chamber sat in stunned silence. Zarek wasn't sure what terrified him more, the humans' ability to defy death on the battlefield, or the fact that they hadn't even revealed everything they could do. General Corral of the Tirvan hierarchy had studied the reports. He had heard the whispers, the superstitions, the absurd claims about human medics and their so-called defiance of death. And he did not believe them. To him, war was simple, a game of logistics, of resources, of attrition. A war was won by breaking morale, by outlasting the enemy's will to fight. And so, when the hierarchy launched its full-scale invasion against the United Terran forces on the world of Kesson 4, Corral was certain of victory. The humans were resilient, yes, but every species broke under enough pressure. All he had to do was break them. The battle for Kesson 4 had raged for 72 hours. The human defensive lines should have collapsed by now. The sheer weight of the hierarchy's war machine should have overwhelmed them. And yet, they were still fighting. More than that, they weren't dying. Corral stood in the command bunker, staring at the holodisplay in cold disbelief. The numbers didn't make sense. The humans should have suffered twice as many casualties. Their forward positions had been obliterated by orbital bombardments, their supply routes severed, their soldiers pushed to the brink. And yet, they remained standing. "This is impossible," one of his officers whispered. Corral said nothing. He simply watched as, across the battlefield, human medics, those so-called non-combatants, ran through fire, dodging plasma bolts as if they had no fear of death. A Tirvan sniper lined up a shot, his rifle's crosshairs locked onto a human medic, dragging a wounded soldier to safety. Corral barely had time to blink before the sniper's head vanished in an explosion of blood and bone. A single, precise bullet from a human marksman had obliterated him from over a kilometer away. That wasn't the first time it had happened either. Every time a Tirvan tried to target a human medic, something stopped them. A sudden mortar strike, a perfectly timed artillery shell, a sniper's bullet, as if the humans had predicted their every move. The medics were not protected by luck. They were protected by an entire army willing to kill anything that dared touch them. And that was why the humans weren't suffering the casualties they should have, because they didn't allow it. Corral's fists clenched. "Their medics are the key," he muttered. "Cut them off. Separate them from the front lines. Force them into a kill zone." The officers scrambled to obey, barking commands into the communication relays. A strike team of elite Tirvan commandos was deployed, moving through the ruined cityscape, positioning themselves to encircle the largest concentration of human medics. It was perfect. The trap was perfect. And then, it wasn't. Because Corral had made a fatal mistake. He had assumed human medics were just doctors. The strike team moved in, silent, unseen, plasma blades drawn. Their orders were clear: eliminate every last human medic in the sector. The humans did not run. They did not beg. They did not panic. They fought. The first human, one of the medics, identified by his red-marked armband, moved faster than the commandos could react. A scalpel. That's what he used. A goddamn scalpel. And with it, he sliced open a commando's throat before he could even scream. The others raised their weapons, but the humans were already moving. Another medic slammed a combat knife into a commando's chest, twisting the blade with surgical precision. A third grabbed a fallen plasma rifle, firing in short, controlled bursts. These weren't doctors. These weren't non-combatants. These were human medics, and they had trained for this. Corral listened in horror as the strike team's vital signs flatlined, every single one of them dead. The comm channel crackled with a final transmission, the last words of a dying Tirvan commando. "They're surgeons," the voice rasped. "They know where to cut." Silence. Corral staggered back from the command table. His mind raced. His thoughts spiraled. He had tried to eliminate human medics, and in doing so, he had awakened something worse. Because now he was their patient, and human medics did not show mercy. General Corral was running out of options. The battle for Kesson 4 was collapsing, not because of the human soldiers, not because of their weapons, their strategy, or their superior numbers. Because of their medics. Corral had studied war for decades. He had seen how battles turned on the strength of logistics, on the availability of reinforcements, on the ability to sustain the fight longer than the enemy. But never had he seen a war where the front line was being held together by doctors. It was unnatural. His forces had fired on human battalions for hours. They had targeted their weak points, collapsed entire buildings onto their positions, bombarded them from orbit. And yet, the humans kept standing. Because every time a soldier fell, a medic was there. Because every time a unit was crippled, a medic patched them back together. Because every time the Tirvan forces thought they had the humans cornered, the medics, the so-called non-combatants, turned them into something far, far worse. The dead should have stayed dead, but the humans didn't allow it. Corral gritted his teeth, his talons digging into the metal of the command table. He forced himself to focus on the battlefield map, but the numbers were a nightmare. His troops were dying faster than they should be. And then, the reports came in. Field report, Alpha Sector. "They're pushing forward. Our forces hit them with a direct artillery strike, but, by the gods, they're still moving. The wounded. They're not retreating. They're not retreating." Field report, Beta Sector. "Our squads just got overrun. The humans, they weren't even firing their weapons. They just charged, screaming something about covering their medics, and then the medics took over. I saw one of them rip a knife out of his own leg and use it to stab my commander in the throat." Field report, Gamma Sector. "We captured one. A medic. We thought he was unarmed, thought he was helpless. We were wrong. He told us he was going to fix us. Then he started breaking bones, one by one. I can still hear the screaming." Corral felt his stomach churn. This wasn't a battle anymore. This was surgery, and the humans, the medics, were the ones holding the scalpel. "This is..." His voice trembled. "This is impossible." Across from him, one of his officers, Commander Vrask, was shaking. His scaled hands clenched into fists, his tail twitching in raw, primal fear. "I watched a human medic cut into his own soldier," Vrask whispered. His voice was hollow, his eyes distant, as if reliving the horror in real time. His comrade was dying. No pain suppressors, no anesthetics, just raw surgery on the battlefield. Corral swallowed hard. "And?" Vrask's throat tightened. The soldier screamed, but he lived. That was it. That was why they were losing. Every other army in the galaxy accepted death as inevitable. But humans refused to acknowledge it. The final battle should have been a slaughter. The Tirvan forces had the high ground. They had fortifications. They had air superiority. And yet, they lost. Not because of the human soldiers, but because of the medics. The Tirvan watched in growing terror as human doctors, those meant to be healers, those meant to be non-combatants, charged the front lines. They patched wounds while taking fire. They fought with scalpels, with knives, with anything they had. And when their comrades fell, when their soldiers were supposed to be dead, the medics screamed at them to get up. And they did. They always did. Corral stood frozen in his command center, watching the final charge unfold in real time. His forces were breaking. His elite warriors, trained from birth to fight, conditioned to fear nothing, were running. Not from soldiers, not from weapons, but from medics. Because to fight human medics was to fight against death itself. The Tirvan surrendered. It was inevitable. Corral stood before the human general, his talons clenched, his pride shattered. He had never known true fear before today. The human commander regarded him with cold, calculating eyes. Corral exhaled sharply. This was not war. The human's lips curled into a humorless smile. No. Corral's voice trembled. What was it? The human turned, motioning to his medics, the real demons of the battlefield. This, he said, this was a house call.